On to the news review. Protesters have taken to the streets across the United States demanding the reopening of the economies shut by the coronavirus pandemic. Rallies are being held in Arizona, Colorado, Montana and Washington following earlier protests in half a dozen states. Agitation for easing restrictions has grown despite the risk of a COVID-19 resurgence posed by reopening too soon. U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled support for the protests, saying orders in place in several states are too tough. Joining us for more on that is Danny Shaw. He's a senior research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and we also have Michael Schaefer, a librarian for American Culture Studies. Gentlemen, welcome. Mr. Shaw, if I can start with you, and what do you make of these protests? They're calling for an easing of restrictions. Health experts say that could see a spike in coronavirus cases.
These freedom protests reflect just how polarized the United States are. This is largely a very conservative crowd, a crowd that follows and responds to Donald Trump as though he was some type of white knight savior. And because of Trump's tweets from the very beginning that this was a conspiracy and COVID-19 wasn't something to be taken seriously, we've seen this conservative crowd, this libertarian crowd take to the streets, crying for individual freedoms, when we've seen, especially here in New York City, just how deadly COVID-19 is. So these protests really have become the laughingstock, tragically and unfortunately, of the world.
Mr. Schaefer, how is it that the richest country in the world has reached a situation where you've got people lining up queues at the food banks for as long as the eye can see?
Well, that's because the United States government hasn't prepared for something like this. We've been spending our money on unnecessary wars all around the world. We have focused on enriching the top 1% of our population, and we haven't taken healthcare and investment in the future seriously.
Right. And Mr. Schaefer, if I could just stay with you, is Trump defying warnings by health experts, some including in his own task force, who are saying that the lifting of the lockdown at this moment, at this stage, is dangerous?
Well, I'm sure he's not defying them for himself, but he is calling upon other people to defy them. I mean, he's really stimulating, as your other guest pointed out, these protests in a number of states. I think that in addition to the divide that your other guest indicated, we have number of other divides. So it makes sense that the virus would spread most rapidly in urban areas, which are predominantly liberal and left and more identified with the Democratic Party. And the protests are occurring mostly in rural states where the constituency is primarily Republican.
Okay, Mr. Shaw, just staying on President Trump, because he is he's the center of the focus here. He's been accused of politicizing the coronavirus outbreak and shifting blame, on others on numerous occasions and ahead of November's election. Is that something that you would go along with?
Well, the narcissist in chief, the megalomaniac in chief, has defied science, doctors, and from the jump, he has such an arrogant attitude towards everything. Really disgraceful that he is, quote unquote, the representative of the United States. But he appeals to a wide base. He appeals to the very worst in the American personality: racism, fascism, homophobia, xenophobia. And there's no question that the country continues to be polarized around this. As we saw in the earlier report, the federal government's done very little for New York State and the epicenter here in the most oppressed communities of New York. This disease is killing Black people and immigrants and workers and poor people. So that's why, again, in these quote-unquote freedom protests, we saw just how polarized America is.
And Mr. Schaefer, any final thoughts there from you?
Yes, I would agree exactly with that sentiment, although I think it's very important for those of us in the United States who oppose President Trump and want to see a government that is more invested in the needs of the people, that we address the protesters and in a very tolerant and accepting and reasonable way, because I think that there is a division here where there are people who are small business owners who are worried about the Byzantine process that they have to go to get bailed out, and they do have some kind of concern, legitimate concern about their economic future.
Absolutely. Mr. Shaw, just finally, I suppose that's where it comes down to. Is on one hand, there are people that are suffering financially, as is the case around the globe. And on the other, you have health, you've got health guidelines about lifting or easing of restrictions. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, my colleague is 100% correct. The attitude has to be of tolerance. It has to be an attitude of education, because we're not trying to point the finger at these individuals who really from day one have never had access to an education that teaches them about other countries in the world and intolerance and an anti-racist education. So we have a lot of work in front of us in terms of educating people across this country. A lot of people are falling into conspiracy theories, and as I said, the worst type of backwardness that I mentioned before. So definitely the task before us, the new opportunity that we have with 22 million people newly unemployed, is a process of education and organizing. May 1st, all of our rent is due, and who's going to be able to pay it?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank our guest, Danny Shaw, Senior Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and Michael Schaefer, a librarian for the American Culture Studies. And dear viewers, thank you for staying tuned to this edition of the News Review.